Welcome, everybody, to the October 2019 Circle of Fellows, episode 50. I'm Shel Holtz. I am the Director of Internal Communications at WebCore, commercial contractor in San Francisco, and an IABC Fellow, and your moderator for today's session, which is all about building value in the client-consultant relationship. And luckily, we have four consultants with us today who can shed light on how they build those kinds of relationships. I'm going to let you each introduce yourselves as I see you on the screen, which means we'll start with you, Jim Shaffer.
Hi, thank you very much, Shel. I started my consulting in 1980. I was with Towers Perrin, the consulting firm, for 20 years. Primarily focusing in the area of communication and change management. I then retired and started my own firm. So I've been on the big consulting firm side, as well as my own side as an independent consultant. And we focus on helping organizations improve their business, financial, and operating results through strong leaders and highly engaged people. One of the nice things about what we do as an independent consultant instead of with a big firm is that we're able to pick and move quickly in a lot of instances. And so I'm going to share some of that with you today.
Great. And then Jim number two, Jim Lukaszewski.
Jim Lukaszewski. I've been doing this for 42 years. I came out of government. I have a college degree in political public relations, but my career has been totally focused on trouble, organizations, products, people, circumstances, and issues in trouble. And it's really two major areas. The consulting part of solving these problems, but the leadership part is the key to it. And so I spend a lot of times, as my colleagues do, with the very senior people in an organization, working through the issues and problems that are driving them crazy, and for which I might add, they're largely often responsible for them themselves. Anyway, so we'll talk about some of those things and how you talk about yourself as a consultant, and I call this being a trusted strategic advisor.
Right. Thank heavens for self-inflicted wounds. It keeps us busy, right? Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. I'm here in rainy North Vancouver. I've been consulting now for 30 years and started out with a small consulting firm and after some corporate time, and then went out on my own as an independent. I've always worked. When I say independent, my company is incorporated, and I'm the principal consultant. I've always worked independently, though, never with employees. So slightly different structure than some other consulting agencies. I bring together virtual strategic alliances when I need to for the project at hand. And I have some go-to people that I go to regularly, but I sort of keep scanning for new assets to bring to my clients and their projects. I focus on storytelling, and that bridges from internal communications to external communications and everything in between. It's kind of something I've been talking about for most of the time I've been consulting, and is now finally the buzzword I always hoped it would be. So looking forward to chatting today.
And George.
Yeah, I'm George McGrath. I'm a public relations consultant based in New York City. I've worked in the field for over 30 years, spent a lot of that time both on the client side and on the large agency side, and started my own solo consulting firm about 6 years ago. Like Jennifer as well, I also work in partnership with a lot of other independent consultants. So in addition to looking always to build new business with clients, I'm always looking to find new talent to work with.
Great. And I should probably mention that even though I am on the client side, I spent 21 years as an independent consultant and 5 years with HR consulting firms in the communications practices, William M. Mercer first and Alexander Consulting Group after that. Just moved back to the client side almost exactly 2 years ago. I think I'm about 10 days shy of my second anniversary. So glad to have you all here, and very happy to have those of you who are watching in real time. For those of you who are watching in real time, you can ask the panel questions. You can see the hashtag to use on Twitter in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, COF50. I am monitoring that over here on my second monitor, and as questions come up, I will pose them to the panel. Until we get those questions, though, I have a long list of topics that we can discuss. Some of these are the ones that IABC set up as part of this being their monthly topic. I know they had their Twitter chat on this just yesterday. But from the perspective of the client, knowing that you all are currently consultants, how would you suggest they go about identifying the consultant to work with, especially when they're going to be working with more than one? As a lot of communication departments do, you may have different consultants engaged in different specific activities or initiatives, or based on different specialties. How do you manage that? How do you find them? How do you choose them? How do you manage it?
Well, I'll be glad to start with some of the ways that I've done that. I think that the key thing is to know a few things, and one is what are you going to focus on? What are your resources going to need to be as you go to the marketplace to bring really good consultants into you? What works well with different kinds of consultants? One other thing is, do they play together well? One of the things that I found working in a large hospital in New Jersey a number of years ago was that I had been asked by the CEO to work with a number of his members of his leadership team to strengthen that team. In the process, though, other departments were creating their own consulting relationships with people, and those people started kind of stepping around over each other, and they started getting into the kinds of things that the leadership team was trying to do. So one of the things that has been very clear to me is I'm looking at building a consulting base, whether it's where I am, where I have 13 partners, or whether it's in a company, is to make sure you're working with people who like each other, work well to each other, and have complementary areas of expertise. There's some people who are really good process people, they're good strategy people, they're good operations people. It's nice to have a real nice balance so that you can draw upon them as you need them for your own organization.
And I'll add to that, Jim. I think too, it depends on obviously the kind of work you're looking to have done. In many cases, and for many of us, we've worked long term with clients, and so in many ways, if that's the kind to bring on, then it's about fit. Do you who plays together well? Do you speak the same dialect? Are you going to show up well for each other? I'm working with the National Financial Services Organization right now, who have done something I think is quite innovative. They, a year ago, we're about a year in, a little over a year ago, went out to tender on looking for a stable of consultants. And they ended up bringing in, ranging in experience in sectors, in length of experience, et cetera, who they fully intend will be around longer than many of them will. They put us through a full orientation, and we are deployed on specific projects as needed and working closely with the comms team. But we are there. We've been deputized by them to fully show up on some large scale projects where it makes sense to sort of contain an individual within a project. And from my perspective, it's working very well.
Have any of the others among you been through an orientation when you started working with a client? I like that, but that is nothing I've heard of before. I
guess in the parlance of HR, this is called onboarding, I guess. Mm-hmm. And my recommendation for hiring consultants is to start early. I think one of the issues that organizations face, especially with staff functions like ours, is that we don't really look at these things until we have to look at them. And in fact, when we have to look at them, we often find extraordinary resistance to hiring outside help. And the boss often has to say, look, just get it done. And like you guys, you're doing fine, but we got some issues we got to deal with. And there is this tendency to sort of band together when serious issues arise, and the major staff people sort of lock arms around the boss and the senior team and keep everybody from talking to them, as though somehow the best advice is only going to come from the people around them. But the thing you have to recognize is when it's an urgent and important issue, the boss wants information from any source that seems reliable or seems useful, maybe not even reliable. And the job of an internal advisor in these circumstances is to facilitate meetings with the senior people, with the folks who can provide the information, services, or knowledge or experience that the boss needs. And the reason this is so important is that most bosses are pretty upset with their people because they understand and know immediately that they're being essentially walled off from other opinions. And the thing that builds credibility in internal staffs is the strength and the foresight to begin finding these people ahead of time and getting them oriented to some of the people in the company that they might be working with. That is part of the onboarding process. And I think also a lot of times companies tend to brief the consultants, overbrief them, so to speak. This whole panel, I'm not good at math, but basically this is about 30 to 40 years of between 30 and 40 years experience for each of us. So we've probably been through a lot of stuff, and typically we have to be patient to listen through some of the most interesting stuff that they think important. But generally speaking, I like to clue the consultants I'm going to have hired or have considered to have a list of questions of their own that they need answers. So there's a productive discussion from the start, from the outside consultant's perspective, because otherwise the discussion never happens, and there's always a disconnect. And the other problem is in the outside consulting, unless you're well briefed, unless you really understand the circumstance, you're not really starting where the problem is. You're starting where you are as an outsider, and it takes a while to get these things going to work. And it's hard sometimes when you're that far behind starting out. So this onboarding issue is a really important one, and I've actually put a small document together called the Trusted Strategic Advisors Manifesto, which I'm happy to send to anyone who was interested. And it talks about the 10 most important areas the outside consultant should consider as they move through their jobs and work and acquire clients.
I agree with Jim completely. I think that I'm trying to think here of the bigger consulting assignments that I've had, which have spanned some time. They've all started with an introduction to the organization of one form or the other. Usually it's a start with the leadership team, and then using your term orientation, which is exactly what it is. Part of it is sitting in meetings and listening to people. And I like to do a lot of listening and ask a lot of questions at the outset. I also like to go out into the field, whether it's the Georgetown, Kentucky Toyota plant, get out into the paint shop, get out into the various different areas of the organization and talk to people, learn from people, and then come back and start to identify, okay, what's the real problem here? What are the root causes of the problem, and how can we make those root causes go away? So I think their orientation is very, very helpful. In fact, I would strongly recommend to somebody that they have ongoing orientation, that ongoing meetings and conversations. I just saw this out there in the paint shop at Toyota. What does this mean? And get people's input before we start trying to fix the problem.
George?
Well, I would just add, I think that's
George, I just lost your audio.
Can you hear me?
We got it again. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think Jim just made a great point about this needs to be an ongoing relationship that you build, and particularly if you have the opportunity to get involved in the client's ongoing communication planning sessions. There's typically a lot of an annual planning session around budgeting. There are plans for product launches and other things. And if you can be in the room for that, you can demonstrate value in the room, but you're also going to be much better prepared to respond and serve the client.
Jim Lukaszewski, you mentioned that it's possible for the client to send you too much information, to overload you. I've always asked for everything they can lay their hands on. I want to know the business plan and the marketing plan, and if they have documentation on values and vision and mission, anything. I'll take way too much because I don't know where the insight is going to come from, where I'm going to see something in a document that provides me with the kind of information that's going to be helpful. I don't know how all of you feel about getting overloaded with documentation at the launch of an engagement, but to me, the more the better.
Oh, I agree with you. Many times people will tell me, well, I don't mean to overload you. And I say, no, please overload me as much as you have about this subject that we're going to be dealing with. And let me figure out what I think is important or not, and what I don't understand or do understand, because I'm going to be coming back to you and probably asking you questions and other people questions to better understand what's on this sheet of paper that I don't understand.
Well, my practice might be Wednesday. Please go ahead.
I agree with you all, and I do the same. I ask for everything you can send me. I'll throw out a bit of a contrary perspective, though, just for our consideration, which is that on a few occasions in the last few years, I've had clients do that transfer of massive amounts of information with the expectation that I'm going to sort through a lot of what, frankly, they should be sorting through. And so I have gotten a little more specific about what I'm asking for. I ask them to prioritize, if I'm asking for all the annual reports, just as an example, it's probably not a great example, but if they're giving me a set of comms plans or something, I'll ask them to please take the time to go through and flag priority areas, things that worked, that didn't work, etc. Because what I don't necessarily feel our job as consultants is to do is to sort through the volume. Our job is to sort through the meaning.
One of the points that IABC listed in the bullets about what we were going to cover today is related to the gig economy. What they said was how to hire and manage an array of consultants in a gig economy. I know that there are gig resources out there that you can use to hire a consultant. This being I guess we'll have to call it the Uber of consultants. There are several. Do you think that makes much of a difference? Are people not doing their due diligence just because maybe they're handling the payment through a middleman app? Is this having an impact, do you think, on the world of consulting?
I don't see it. No.
I was actually wanted to make a comment about the previous subject. My practice may be a little different than most. I only work in these super crazy circumstances. I'm never the first consultant hired. I'm hired about on the fourth time because it's tough to work with me because I, as all of us have, been through a variety of scenarios. I summed them up for somebody writing a book when I was included in it, and I went over my 42 years, and I've actually been through 416 scenarios with 369 companies over 42 years. And it's just kind of interesting. The moment they begin to share with me what's happening with them, I probably know more about it than I definitely know more about it than they do. Yet they want to brief me. I think it's really essential, particularly with people with lots of experience, is to also have an onboarding process for yourself. Because I think, when the outsiders come in, there's almost always this tension between the folks inside and the folks outside. And it's, why do they hire people like you? I mean, you're going to create some messes for me to clean up when you're gone. You're no smarter than I am, or I'm as smart as you are. You're not going to tell them anything that I haven't told them over the last 9 years, blah, 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 blah. So, I think there has to be an onboarding process, which explains why, to some degree, you were hired. And in so many circumstances, I think you can identify the reasons that they go outside when there are talented people inside. And I think my list is a pretty short one, but they think they're going to get more candor from an outside voice than from an inside voice. Like it or not, this is how the internal people, the people who hire you or order your hiring, they want somebody who can help them with what to do next. This is the biggest problem in public relations, and I can understand why the other practice you want this other information. I'm not going to be around that long. What happened? The reason that I get hired is because I've been in that hole before, and I got out of it and survived. And there are a lot of talented people in our profession who they just haven't been in this particular pocket of trouble. And so once we go walk through that process and what's going to happen from my perspective and the consultants, other consultants, they really can pick it up and move with it. And I want to help them get over the resentment of having the boss or somebody up higher than them order them to get somebody, quote unquote, better than they are, I guess. But
I think what you used the word perspective there, and I think that's what happens is that these people have been just like I was when I was on the other side, and that is I get too close to it. I know all about this and all about the personalities and all this and this and this. What I think we can help people do is step back and say, let me, and I teach this in my workshops, is what does your physician say after you finish telling him or her all about everything that hurts about you? The physician usually says, well, let me have a look. And that's exactly what I try to do is after I hear all the close hand stuff, then I try to have a look at it and say, what about from this perspective? What do you think is the big issue here? What's causing it? What can make it go away? What have you tried? What haven't you tried? Let's go.
Well, you raise an interesting point. I think if any PR or communications team is lacking a competency, your options are to hire someone with the competency, train somebody you already have, and build that competency, or to outsource for that competency. And that's where consultants come in. What do you think is the appropriate model if you're being brought in not to manage a project, but to fill a gap where this competency is required, say for a project or an initiative? Should they hand you work to do that you bring back by the deadline, or should you find a way to become part of the team and operate as a member of the communication staff?
Pretty hard to do, actually, because you're just not that well received, especially in communications. We're just so proud of our skill in doing these things. We just don't like outside voices. But what I try to do is to talk about what I've been asked to do, and how I want to make certain that they are plugged into everything that's going on. People worry that I'm going to be in meetings that they're not going to be in. So I talk about how I handle meetings. And the fact is, this rarely happens with senior people. They are included. They are complimented, and their egos built up by the boss who knows there's this conflict going on because they got some fancy guy with a long last name who flew in first class and whatever. So I can talk about these things and walk through the issues with people and assure them that basically, I will plug them into the things that they may not be privy to as promptly as I can and as completely as I can. If I'm told, as often happens, by the attorney or somebody else, you can't share this information, I have a little lecture about them for that circumstance, because this instruction on the part of attorneys and others to not talk and be sort of in the inner circle is really counterproductive to what I can accomplish working with the entire team going forward. So I'm pretty persuasive about these things. And again, as I mentioned, they've tried a lot of things. They talk to me. Sometimes people talk to me over 4 years and they don't hire me till essentially somebody says, quit screwing around and get somebody who knows what they're doing and get this done, which happens a lot in large organizations. So we don't have to, it's my pathway might be a little shorter, but more complicated just because of how they hire people like that.
Jennifer, I know that because you're focused on storytelling, you've got I think a different set of circumstances than Jim does. Do you find yourself ever embedded with a team to get that kind of work done?
Absolutely. It's pretty much the way I work. In fact, in the example I was citing earlier with a large financial services client, this individually, the consultants they brought on have been completely embedded in large scale projects for exactly the reason you would guess, which is that you never, like any aspect of our work, you never know where the storytelling is going to come from. In a couple of other large scale projects I'm working on, I'm working on a few corporate history books for clients, and I and my team are, I would say, fully embedded within the client team. So it's a extremely cooperative working relationship where I'm flattered to be turned to for overall strategic direction in specific situations, but I've got my sleeves rolled up, as do they, side by side, very cooperatively.
Well, I believe very strongly in having a lot of ownership on the part of the client into anything that I'm working on, whether it's a quality problem, a productivity issue, an on-time delivery issue, or whatever it may be, whether it's big or whether it's small. My focus is always on trying to identify what the root cause of the problem is, but have others join me for that identification, because I want them to own it when I leave. And so if we have a reduction in OSHA recordables of 35%, as we did in an operation in Ohio recently, I don't want to walk away and know that they've dropped everything that I suggested and I recommended. I want to know that they own it, they know about it, they helped fix it, they helped identify the root cause. And so it becomes about us, it's not about me.
George, what about your situation? You do, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, pretty classic public relations work. Do you ever find yourself embedded with the communications team, or are you sort of brought into just here's your assignment, go do this?
No, I think it works best when we are working as partners with the communications team, and we typically have got long-term client retainer relationships where we participate in the planning sessions that go on, whether it's annual planning around budgeting or project planning around events, product introductions, or other developments. And you develop over time a very iterative relationship where you try to get into the stream of what they're doing, be at their side at these planning sessions, see the material they see. And I encourage them, again, as the others have said, to send us everything that's relevant to the project at hand. While we're working on external communications, I really benefit from seeing a lot of the internal communications that are going on, because it tells me things going on inside the company that I'm not just seeing from my relationship with the PR department. So, for example, in one case, I saw in an internal publication they were reporting to employees about a new virtual reality design studio they had developed. And it was a big topic in the news at the time. And I said to the PR client I was dealing with, hey, this is really interesting. Why don't we ever talk about this? He said, well, it wasn't that interesting to me. I said, all right, well, that's fine, but this is the kind of stuff that we can use. So let's just keep it simple. Just put me on the distribution list for the publication. And so sometimes I find that, a lot of clients don't even know how good some of the material they have is. And that's, again, the perspective an external consultant brings on it. They're so used to seeing this stuff every day. It's like, yeah, there's those guys in the IT department doing something else again. But you can look at it and say, hey, this is a great story for the Wall Street Journal, which actually turned out to be a page one story in the Wall Street Journal. So a close working relationship with them is important. Getting to understand them in terms of just the realities of what they're dealing with every day on the job is important. Because one thing I've seen over the last 30 years is the tremendous amount of stress and pressure that clients are under. Look, the leisurely business lunch where you can kind of kick ideas around or talking about over golf, that's long in the past. They're all getting up every day early, hitting the conference calls, hitting the webcasts, running through things, and you got to just run with them to help them.
I want to cover a topic that is, I think, probably very basic and fundamental, but I would be remiss if I didn't address it. And that is the choice that a client has between an independent consultant and an agency or a consulting firm. Jim, you were with Towers for all those years. I was at Mercer and Alexander. George, I think you were with an agency, weren't you?
Yeah, Hill and Knowlton, and then some other agencies within the WPP group.
All right. How should a client go about evaluating those choices? And I have to share just a brief story. I won't name any names, but I was working with an organization. I had my scope of work. They had a parallel scope of work they needed done. I recommended an independent consultant for this, who you all know this person. He is an IABC Fellow. He would have been perfect for this job. And they ended up hiring Hill and Knowlton because they already had an existing relationship on their PR side. This was an internal communications assignment. And I remember going to lunch with the two consultants from H&K who they brought on board. And I said, what is your background? And it turned out neither of them had ever worked in internal communications in any capacity before. They just assumed that employees were another PR audience, and that would be fine. And you can imagine how that engagement went. So, I mean, how do you talk to clients about that particular choice? What should their considerations be?
Well, I think having been in a big consulting firm and now in a smaller one, I think in many cases, people are hiring the individual, the person, and the talent and the skills and the resources they may have behind them. And if you're talking to somebody like myself, I have 13 partners who I draw upon for different kinds of areas like compensation and that sort of thing. I'm not a compensation consultant. I'm a management consultant in a fairly broad way. So I think that in many cases, we buyers are hiring the consultant, not necessarily the firm. But there is definitely a group of people out there who I think it makes sense is if we go to Towers or Hill and Knowlton or a large organization like that, we're going to be treated differently than this individual sitting over here who has no resources. So there are times when the problem really requires a lot of resources, and there are times when it doesn't. And there are times when sometimes the independent practitioners are independent practitioners and are very, very good, and they escaped a large firm because they weren't able to do as much as they could when they're out on their own.
Yeah, and I would have to say that one thing that you will never encounter with an independent consultant is, I won't go out and meet with a prospect, and then when they sign on the dotted line, I'll send a junior person out to do the work. As an independent, you get what you get.
And I think it's a matter of cultural fit too, right? In organizations where there is a degree of hierarchy and perhaps a more complex org chart, there is perhaps a better fit for an agency that approaches things from a similar point of view. And let's be frank, it can often come down to cost, where independent consultants don't necessarily have the overhead, the additional expenses that an agency might have. They also, that it's a sort of a get what you pay for type of situation where an independent may or may not also have the additional resources if, they've got to take a day off because their kid's sick or whatever the case may be. So I think it's a matter of fit, and there's probably a right fit for every situation. I'm just going to briefly mention, and we can come back to it if you want, but a few years ago, I did some research for a presentation I was doing at the IABC Canada West Region Conference, which coincidentally is coming up in 2 weeks again in Banff. This one was in Calgary, and I presented on managing the consultant-client relationship. And so I did some Twitter-based research leading up to that presentation and asked both clients and consultants, what do you want us to know about each other? What's the number one thing you want us to know as consultants and vice versa? And I'll just, Shel, if it's good timing, a couple of the sort of high points that came out of that. So here was what consultants want clients to know, and I'll just maybe mention 2 or 3. Number one was, and so I've opened this up for debate because we may not all agree on this. Then the research I did was, I work for you, not your company. This is what consultants want clients to know. Number 2 was, get me so close to your work and your team that you confide in me and consider me an extension of your team. And we've sort of covered that. And number 3 was to Jim Lukaszewski's point. Don't be afraid to let me talk to people. Let me get embedded. Let me hear those conversations. There are several more, but those are the top 3 from the consulting point of view.
I find the first one most interesting. That I work for you, the individual who hired me, as opposed to the company that is, that's the name on the check that I get in the mail. How does everybody feel about that? Do you work for the individual who brought you in, or do you work for the company?
A very dangerous idea, in the sense that you are, if you're working for upper management, one thing that separates management, upper management, from the rest of the management is that the higher you go, the more your work and motivation every day is driven by the work you're doing and not about all the other distractions in the business. When you hire a consultant, one of the things that a consultant is asked by almost everybody they work for is they want, because you're an outsider and you told them you have this broad experience, whatever it is, they want you to evaluate all the people that you're working with. This happens in every case. And I think really maybe you're hired by a division, maybe that's what you're talking about, as opposed to the whole company. But I think that outside consultants, have a loyalty. I mean, it's assumed there's a loyalty to the larger issue, the larger things that are going on in the company, regardless of how personally you'd like to have a relationship with these people. If you have any contact with top management or even upper middle management, you're being asked to be an observer for them as well as a worker for whoever hired them within the company. Something to think about.
Yeah, Jim, I agree with you on that. I can't think of a time wherever I would have said to or even thought that I'm not working for the company, I'm working for the individual. The only times that I would do that, might do that, but with quotation marks around it, and that is, I'm oftentimes asked by the leader of the organization, the CEO or the plant leader or whatever it may be, to work with Joe over here, because I think he has a lot of strengths, but I don't think he's using them. I'd like you to spend time coaching him, working with him. Every conversation that you two have is confidential, because I know that has to have that confidentiality so that this young person usually can thrive and can get a lot better. I'm still working for the company, but I'm honoring the person that I've been asked to work and to develop. I will oftentimes ask the person I'm working to develop if I have permission to mention to the CEO or whoever the person is who hired me about some of these issues, and I will abide by the answer that person gives me. I don't think we're working for the individual as in a selfish, don't pay any attention to the organization, you're focused on me. I think that's wrong.
George, go ahead.
Well, I would just put in a counterpoint. I agree with what everybody said about who the ultimate client is, but I think we also get involved in these very human relationships with our day-to-day client contacts. And, over time, particularly if it's a long-term relationship, you get to know their needs, their fears, their career aspirations. And a lot of this involves helping them navigate through the issues they're dealing with the company. Other than a spouse or a partner, they may not have a trusted person that they can talk to and say, these are the things that keep me up at night. This is what I worry about with the relationship with my boss. I don't seem to be connecting with senior management in my company. Why is that? And often it's a conversation over dinner or a drink, or if you get together on a weekend. And I think that's just helping another person that you got a business relationship with, but they just got a human need that you've got to help.
It's a really good point, George. I have to say that there have been a couple of clients that I had over the years who have become very good friends. There's one I would list among my best friends. Started out purely as a professional relationship. I don't even remember how she found me to bring me into the organization. She's now a consultant, and we still talk all the time. In fact, she hosts a show on my podcast network. So I think those connections are unavoidable, right? You work closely with somebody over time, and it's hard to maintain that boundary when you're spending that kind of time together. Mm-hmm. Jennifer, I'm wondering about
And I
the
think
top
that really
results on the other
highlighted
side.
when
Go ahead.
Absolutely. And I will say that when I did this presentation a few years ago, that same statement was just as controversial as it, or had just as many different perspectives as we've had today. And just as a closing note on that, I think some of what you're talking about, George, is the overlap between consultant and coach, and friend, frankly. And I'm really interested in the rising role of consultants in a coaching role within organizations, especially from a communications point of view. Anyway, let me go to the top three that I heard from the clients want consultants to know. And these are fairly straightforward, but the first is build my trust. Don't get caught up in my office politics. Don't get caught up in the drama that's here. One of the reasons I'm bringing you in is because you're going to bring that outside perspective. You are going to be my advisor. Number two was don't nickel and dime me, and this would vary depending on the type of work we're doing. But people in the research, I said the clients said, don't apologize for your hourly rate. Don't apologize for the budget you submit. Be willing to work with me on a budget that might work overall, but don't let there be surprises. And then on a sort of related note from an operational perspective, was around timing. And that was meet deadlines no matter what. Don't ever blindside. We are hired as consultants to make problems go away, not to add to the stress of our clients. Don't come to me just a few days before deadline and say you're not going to do it. You're not going to be able to do it. Mm-hmm. So those were the top three. Those are fairly straightforward, I think.
Boy, that last one sounds like it was based on experience.
No, the client has also the folks we're all working for, since we're a staff function. They have their requirements too, and they're often quite different from ours. And I sort of one of my door openers turned out to be a comment I made years ago to somebody about they were commenting on the fact that their communications people were not making progress the way they wanted to, and they needed some outside help, and blah blah blah. And I said, well, you got some of the most interesting and I think talented people in the business working for you. He says, yeah, but they don't really start where I'm at. I think this is a very interesting comment. Most communications consultants that I've worked with tend to start with communications. And my philosophy shifted years ago to recognize that if you really want to have impact and influence and access, you have to start where the boss is, or where the generation of the assignments come from, and to make certain that that's the vantage point that you really start from. And in my experience, the list isn't very long either. The people that we work for want candor. They want help with what to do next. They want, especially they want advice on the spot. This is one of the biggest reasons outside consultants are hired. Typically with internal staff consultants, they meet with an executive or a group to discuss a problem, ask questions, then they go away somewhere and work on stuff. And then they come back at some point, maybe in the same day, with suggestions and recommendations. But the issue really is that, business happens in real time and things are moving ahead, including issues, in a real time frame. So if you had a meeting at 9 a.m, come back at 4 p.m, management is already 5-6 hours ahead of you in what they're thinking about and talking about. But because they need to advise, they need your services, the internal people, they'll hear the stuff that you come from 9 o'clock in the morning, so to speak. So the issue really is keeping up with the folks that are experiencing the issues and questions in real time. And that's why that's one of the differences. It seems to me, and everything I would point out as a difference between an internal consultant and an external consultant. Really, it's a really matter of understanding what your client is looking for and delivering those. And one of the things they want is advice on the spot. And that's a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
We're as outsiders, we're taking a gamble on, theoretically, on offering answers or solutions, or as I talk about, options for moving forward right away, as opposed to going away somewhere and talking about it. But these are the thing to find out, I think, really is, what are the metrics, so to speak, of the people who are running the business. What are they looking for? What do they want? What do they need? And a lot of times it doesn't have anything to do with even the subject matter. It has to do with how we behave and how we respond. It's just a different way of thinking about it. This notion that every problem is a management problem or a leadership problem before it's any other kind of problem, including communications. We all know where it's going. We all know communications is going to be a big player throughout the activity. But if all we're focusing on is communication, here's what happens. Unlike any other staff function, when you give communication advice, unlike the accountant, unless the boss is an accountant, they listen, they learn, they do what they want to do, that sort of thing. But when it's communication advice, since everybody I've ever worked for in my career has felt that they are a better communicator than I am. I even ask people like my colleagues when they talk, how many people work for bosses who think they're not good communicators? Raise your hand. If there's 100 people, one will raise their hand, and I'll say, well, there's always one in a crowd this big. But they think they're better communicators. They often think that's the reason they have the jobs they have. So they have a mental content. They're not learning anything from us. They're saying, is this guy as smart as he thinks he is? I can think of better ways to do this than he can. And we have to get around that. So
another thing that I hear often in subtle ways and different ways, Jim, is help me envision the future. Help me see what you've been there before. You've worked with lots of other companies. You've worked with other CEOs or whatever. What is liable to happen if we do this, or this? And I've gotten to the point over the years where I offer that up early on, and I don't make it so that the CEO has to ask that question. I go and knock on the door, theoretically, physically and intellectually, and say, by the way, I've seen this happen so many times. I go back to the physician, the medical analogy, that you have these kinds of considerations. This is what's going on in your organization. My experience is that this is what it's going to turn into, and we need to act on it right away, or we have some time. But help me envision the future is the question I get and the comment I get an awful lot.
I'm working on a book called The Pathology of Management Misbehavior. Medical analogies can be very helpful.
One of the questions that IABC listed is how do you build and maintain the loyalty that you need with clients to keep them coming back? And Jennifer, I think this gets back to that top answer that you got from consultants, is that I work for you and not the company. One of the things that I was experiencing late in my consultancy was the people I worked with were retiring. They were bringing in young new people who didn't know me, and they knew other people that they wanted to work with, and suddenly I was not involved with the organization anymore, which seems to speak to the need to be working for the organization rather than the individual. But how do you build that loyalty over time that keeps them coming back to you and transcends the individual who may have brought you in, or who you were working directly for during an engagement?
I think it's very hard. It's just really for one thing, if you work for somebody for 20 years, there's a generational change in the business, and there's no way you can compensate for generational change. And the typical CEO, I think the last data I heard from not Price Waterhouse, but one of the search firms, was the average tenure of a CEO, a new CEO these days, is actually around 41 months. So, the people who are making the big decisions, they always talk about 5-year plans, but the odds are the CEO who makes the 5-year plan is not going to be there to see how it turns out. And this has a real impact on our longevity in the relationships with those we work for.
George, I'm wondering, in those instances where you're more or less embedded in the organization, or members of your team are, doesn't that create relationships with the members of the team who might rise up into the leadership role?
Yeah, well, I give you an example from my own experience. I've got one client, a Fortune 500 company that we've worked with for 15 years, ongoing retainer relationship, and we've gone through 3 or 4 major senior management changes at that organization and 3 or 4 changes in the leadership of the communications function. But people inside the organization have gotten promoted and moved up, and we've worked with those people over time. So we're seen as the people who are the trusted advisor because we've gotten results, we've been around, and you almost become the institutional memory after a while. And so I think in a lot of cases that keeps us around. You got to keep getting results because there's a 30-day out in every contract. So if you're not getting the results done, you're going to be gone. But if you can prove you can get results, if you're bringing new ideas in, if you're giving them very candid, direct advice, not just parroting back what they're telling you, but telling them why that might not work, there's a different way to do it, let's work on a different path, then you build that trust that kind of goes across generations. Now, that's not going to stop. That's not going to protect you from something like they totally restructure a communication function, or they're cutting. They come into some real business issues. They've got to cut budgets, or the philosophy of how they're doing things has just changed. You know, those things sometimes you just can't escape, and then the relationship's done. But there's a lot of ways to keep it going.
Sorry, one thing that I should really stress in these relationships is, so often we try to behave like the people we work for. We tend to report like they do and use numbers like they do. But one of the things I really stress with the people that I work with is, you want to be memorable. I mean, this is really the issue about having relationships. You're doing things and saying things that make you memorable. The storytelling is probably the most crucial aspect of memorability. Being able to, have a punchline and have some self-evident truth, that you're sort of the wise person, even if you're relatively young. But paying attention to this relationship and sort of aiming for doing things. I always say, you've arrived if for example, people quote you when you're not in the room. When you've really arrived, if they quote you when you are in the room. If they tell your stories and give you credit for the stories, or if they tell your stories but they don't give you credit for the story, it really is. Probably the biggest one is, in terms of when you're not there at on time, they will hold up the meeting until you get there. I mean, there are some markers and things that, and I've seen these people develop these relationships in their, as they're insiders or outsiders. And I think you really do have to pay attention to this, but it's sort of a self-serving thing to be memorable, to be quoted, to do things that help people even when you're not there. Builds this connection that makes you valuable.
Yeah, a client recently was describing a up-and-coming executive in their organization. He said, "Yeah, he's like a younger and better-looking George McGrath." So I kind of took that both as a compliment and I was a little insulted at the same time.
I was working for a guy who was 34 years old. I was older than he was. I was pulled out of a operation in one part of their business and told to get to another part of the business because this 34-year-old was going to be taking over and turning the place around. They'd had 2 deaths and an amputation within about 6 months, and they thought it might be time to change a little bit. And so when I got up there, he was very open and said, I really need your help. I know what you've done. I know what your track record is, and I need to have you help me grow in this thing. And so every day we would get together in the morning and we would talk about how you're going to have your leadership meeting and what are we going to do and get rid of we had created a stupid rules committee, and we did all kinds of things that really got the people in the organization to start to gravitate toward this guy. And there was one point, and he and I today are very, very close professional friends. But one of the things that he said to me is the 2 things that I like. One is you're helping to improve the performance of this business. Number 2, I can count on you. And those 2 things, I think, say a lot about loyalty.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Jennifer her thoughts, but she seemed. Can you hear me? We've lost your camera. Oh, it looks like we've lost her altogether. Oh, you're back.
Back.
Yay. Your thoughts, Jennifer, on maintaining loyalty and getting them to come back to you?
I think like most things, you go in looking for what you want in the long run. I always I always start a client consultant relationship assuming and hoping that it will be a long-term one. And so I invest accordingly. I start how I mean to go on. In the case I've referenced in a couple of times working with a financial services company, they set the contract up as a 3-year contract. And so that tells me that they intend to do as they say, a 3-year contract with the intent to renew. And they've said straight out that they imagine that we will be around, maybe around longer than many of them in terms of that institutional memory you mentioned, George. I think it's a two-way investment. I also know fairly quickly, as I'm sure we all do from both sides, when it's not going to be a long-term relationship, when it is a quick in, quick out. Here, I'm the right person to fix this for now, but it's not necessarily the right fit long term. And I think, we're all just more grown up for calling that as we see it.
Mm-hmm. We have about 4 minutes left, and there's one question I wanted to make sure we got to, and that's dealing with difficult clients or difficult consultants, depending on whether you're on the client side or the consulting side. I'm sure you've all had those clients who come at you with scope changes and unreasonable demands, that sense that, they own you. You're going to turn around something that maybe isn't part of the contract. How do you deal with that sort of thing?
Up front, before you start.
Yeah, I haven't really had that much problem, but I think how you deal with it's situational, it's cultural, it's personalities and that sort of thing. I really haven't had that much difficulty with people.
I had a situation a few years ago that prompted me to change the contracts that I developed. It was around the client's obligation to deliver information within a certain time frame or to respond within a certain time frame, as well as my obligation to do that. Again, that's the two-way relationship thing. But in this case, a large multinational corporation didn't pay me for 6 months because they claimed that I hadn't met the timeframes. I had a very clear line of documentation that showed that I had, and in fact, they had been the ones sitting on information, not getting it back, not getting it proved, etc. And eventually, it took a letter from my lawyer to get payment going pretty quickly, but it was a real eye-opener in terms of the client's obligation. So putting that in writing, in addition to just having the grown-up conversation and calling it straight out, I think is essential for everyone.
I had a client once where the person I was working with directly was great, but it seemed like every 2 or 3 days he would forward an email from his boss, whom I had never met or spoken to, and he would say, "Ask your consultant," with quotes around. It just got to the point where when I finished the deliverable had been delivered, and he said, "Let's talk about the next phase of this." I said, "No, there's just not going to be a next phase."
Well, it's nice that you can say that.
Yeah.
I don't have too much trouble because basically I know where the bodies are buried, so they treat me and pay me promptly most of the time.
Hey, Shel, before we quit, one thing I was going to mention in the introduction, and I forgot to, is IBC asked me to do a consulting skills workshop, create a course that it's called something about the strategic advisors. Jim's been referring to it, but IABC does offer that. It is based off of what I created for Towers Perrin and colleagues of mine in terms of an advanced consulting skills course. I took it and redesigned it, and just want people to be aware of the fact that IABC is offering that.
That's great. And I want to let everybody know about the Circle of Fellows episode 51 coming up next month on November 21st. These are always on the third Thursday of the month, so that'll be at noon Eastern on Thursday the 21st on the topic of the looming risk of cyber attack. Are you prepared? Talk about pivoting from one topic to another. Our panel will include Priya Bates, John Devaney, Martha Mazicha, and Mark Schumann. So should be a good panel and enlightening around that. I want to thank all of you for the time and your insights and sharing your experiences. And also want to thank Anna Willie, who behind the scenes rounds up the panelists and makes sure that everybody has everything that they need. We couldn't do it without her. So until next month, thanks, everybody. This has been great.
Thank you, Shel. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Shel.
So.
Good luck.
Bye-bye.